Hi, everybody. Welcome to English Digest. I'm Stephanie.
I'm Tom.
It's our literature unit. It's one of my favorites. I actually like our literature units. But my favorite part of the literature unit is actually the part about the author. J.D. Salinger is the author of The Catcher in the Rye. And we're talking about his masterpiece, his one masterpiece that he had published. Yeah, this is a book that Tom said he studied in college.
Well, I didn't study it. I just read it on my own.
Oh, it wasn't assigned.
No,
okay.
It wasn't part of a class. I just read it on my own. But that was way back in college. I don't want to tell you exactly when I read it, and I don't remember that much about it. All I do remember is that the main character, Holden Caulfield, was kind of having a hard time. He was always finding fault with other people. He thought they were phony. And at the time, I myself was kind of a little cynical. Not as bad as this guy, though.
Right.
I think we all are cynical from time to time. But this guy is an extreme case, and we might learn a little something about his story. So let's continue to talk about the story as he continues his adventure in New York City. Let's read the entire contents of today's lesson now one time.
The following morning, Holden arranges a date with Sally Hayes, an old girlfriend. On the way, he encounters a family with a young son, who is singing a song Holden likes about a catcher in the rye. During their date, Holden is bothered by how Sally interacts with another young man. He sketches a fantasy for her in which they run away together to a remote part of the U.S. Sally rejects the proposal, and Holden verbally abuses her. Ashamed as he realizes his behavior, he tries to make apologies, but she storms off. Holden becomes more depressed and eventually heads home to find Phoebe, his younger sister. He tells her his dream is to be a catcher in the rye, someone who, he thinks, would stand in a field of rye and stop the children playing there from plunging off a cliff. Holden tells her his plan to move to Colorado and work on a ranch, and then he makes a quick exit when his parents come home. Exhausted, Holden thinks of Allie as he walks around New York. He feels like his life is going to end every time he crosses the road, and prays to Allie to keep him safe. He meets Phoebe again and learns that she plans to move to Colorado with him. He convinces her not to and takes her to the zoo, where he experiences a moment of pure happiness watching her ride a carousel. At this point, Holden stops his narrative. He hopes he'll recover from his bout of depression, and he finds himself missing the people he's spoken about. He wishes the story could have continued, revolving like the carousel.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Remember where we left off after day one. Holden Caulfield was in New York City having parties. He was going to the bar. He was almost getting together with a prostitute there. So he's in New York City having himself a good time. So that's where we left off. And the following morning, after the incident with the elevator operator and the prostitute or the sex worker, Holden arranges a date with Sally Hayes, an old girlfriend. So maybe this is a girl he knew from his hometown or something, and she now lives in New York City or something. He calls her up. Hey, I'm in town. Would you like to get together? So, yes, they have a date. And on the way, he encounters a family with a young son who is singing a song Holden likes about a catcher in the rye. So he's on his way to meet his old girlfriend for a date, but he comes across a family there. Maybe he's walking through Central Park or something like that, and there's a family there having fun or something, and the boy is singing a song, and Holden recognizes the lyrics to the song, and the lyrics include a line, a catcher in the rye. Rye. It's a song about a catcher in the rye, whatever that is. A catcher, of course, is somebody who catches something, like a catcher catches the pitches from the pitcher in baseball. And rye, of course, is a kind of grain. I think it's hei mai in Chinese. And rye is used to make various things like rye bread. It's usually very dark. They used to have rye whiskey. They don't really have that so much anymore, but yeah, a kind of whiskey made from rye. But in this particular case, he's talking about a rye field, being in a field with all these rye plants around him.
Right. So I have seen rye bread here for sale in Taiwan, which is kind of special because it's more rare to come across it, but I have seen it for sale.
Kind of sour.
Yeah, it's not sweet at all, unlike your bread here in Taiwan. I know you guys like sweet bread, but this rye bread, it's very dense, and it isn't very sweet, as Tom said. But a lot of people love it, especially Germans, because that's kind of their bread. They
I love
that.
Rye bread. My mother introduced me to rye bread before. Loved her rye bread sandwiches.
I'll buy you some.
Yeah, I can't get it in Taiwan here. At least I don't know where to
I know where it is. Yeah, I've run into it.
Okay, maybe some people like rye bread. Okay, great. But in any case, yes, this is a song about someone who is a catcher in the rye. So then Holden is getting together with his old girlfriend, and during their date, Holden is bothered by how Sally interacts with another young man. Okay, so this is when boys get jealous. Hey, why are you talking to him? You should be talking to me.
Right.
So that's your basic jealousy there. And yes, indeed, he gets upset by that. He sketches a fantasy for her in which they run away together to a remote part of the U.S. Now, to sketch something usually means you take a piece of pencil or a piece of charcoal and you just kind of do a quick drawing of something as you're looking at that sort of thing. It's not a formal drawing, it's just a quick drawing, a sketch, basically. And in this particular case, though, the word sketch is being used to describe the act of describing something. So he kind of tells her about this fantasy he has. A fantasy, of course, is like an idea, a wild idea that you have that's probably not going to happen, but maybe it could. I have a fantasy of climbing to the top of Mount Everest or something like that. It's not ever going to happen, but I have a fantasy. And this fantasy involves them running away together to a remote part of the U.S., maybe to Montana or to Alaska or to Texas or someplace like that.
Well, he says Colorado, but Colorado's not very remote anymore. A lot of people are moving to Colorado. It's so nice. So yeah, instead of drawing this fantasy on a piece of paper, he just uses his words and tells Sally about his fantasy. Sounds like he wants to run away, to just get away from life. And he wants her to go with him. If it's a remote part of any place, it's far away from other people. There aren't a lot of cities around, kind of left alone. Well, Sally listens to his proposal and says, "No way, dude. Forget it." She doesn't like it. She doesn't want to go with him. And Holden verbally abuses her. There are lots of ways that you can abuse people, sadly. Some people are physically abused, meaning someone hits their body, harms them that way. But if you say really mean things that hurt someone's feelings, that really insults them, you're verbally abusing them in that way. So he uses words. Sounds like he's pretty good with words. Remember, he can write very well. So he says mean things to Sally, his old girlfriend. But then she storms off. She leaves him. I would too, ladies. I would get out of there. After she leaves, though, he realizes he's been a jerk. So at the start of the last sentence in the first paragraph, it says, ashamed as he realizes his behavior. So this is set up to tell you what's going to happen next. Because he feels ashamed, he tries to make apologies. So if you're ashamed, you feel really embarrassed or guilty about something you did that was wrong, especially if you hurt someone that you really care about. You kind of feel horrible when you lose your temper. Sometimes you say things you don't mean, and that's when he feels ashamed because of his behavior. And he does want to, say he's sorry, to apologize, or as it says here, to make apologies. you can use that phrase. But Sally has already stormed off. If you storm off, you leave a place, and the way you leave it lets everybody know you are really mad. So she probably stomps off and says, you're a jerk. Get lost.
I never want to see you again.
Yeah.
I can't believe I accepted this date invitation.
Why did I waste time with you?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So she storms off. She leaves rather quickly. And Holden becomes more depressed and eventually heads home to find Phoebe, his younger sister. Now, if you're depressed, you're just feeling really, really sad. It could describe two different kinds of situations. You might be suffering from depression, which is clinical. You have the symptoms. You need to see a doctor about that. Or you could just be really, really sad and not really be clinically depressed. Okay, you might get depressed after the death of your pet dog, for example, or something like that. And yeah, lots of things are going bad for him. He's quit school. He's been rejected by these women in New York City. So he's pretty depressed. He's feeling sorry for himself. And he goes back home to talk to his younger sister, Phoebe.
Phoebe, yeah. Phoebe's a fun name. We're going to talk more about Phoebe and what he says to his younger sister. But first, guys, we're going to listen to our Chinese teacher.
大家好，我是派老师。今天讲解的是7月份 Unit 11-The Catcher in the Rye, Holden Caulfield's Troubled Times 第二天的课文。麦田捕手的主角 Holden 在饭店遭到殴打以后，隔天和他自己的老朋友 Sally 见面，可是呢，他也把 Sally 惹毛了。我们一起来看课文，请同学看到第二句 On the way, he encounters a family with a young son who is singing a song Holden likes about a catcher in the rye. 请同学把 encounters 画起来，他遇到了。接下来请看第三句 During their date,Holden is bothered by how Sally interacts with another young man. Sally 和 Holden 约会，可是 Sally 却和另外一所学校的男生，他们本来就认识了。他和这个男生聊天 ，Holden 呢因此不开心，所以 is bothered by 这里指的呢，倒不是说被打扰，而是因此而不开心。第四句 ，He sketches a fantasy for her, in which这里的 in which 的 which 指的就是 fantasy， 他自己的一些想法。在这个他所想的、他所计划的内容当中 ，they run away together to a remote part of the U.S. 他希望能够跟 Sally 一起到天涯海角，一个遥远的地方，在美国遥远偏远的地方。Sally rejects the proposal. Sally 拒绝。And Holden verbally abuses her. Verbally abuse 请画起来，就是怎样说话骂他。最后一句 Ashamed as he realizes his behavior, he tries to make apologies, but she storms off. 好，请同学特别注意到，这里呢是分词构句，这里所指的是 Holden is ashamed. 那 Holden 呢？他自己呢觉得非常的羞愧。接下来，请同学把这个 storm off 画起来。storm off 它所指的呢，就是很生气的离开。那再请同学看到第二段第一句 ，Holden becomes more depressed and eventually heads home to find Phoebe, his younger sister. Holden 呢变得更加的沮丧，最后呢。他回家去找自己的妹妹 Phoebe.
We're going to take a quick break. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Okay, let's continue to summarize our featured work of literature for the month of July, The Catcher in the Rye. So where we left off, Holden kind of blew his date with his old girlfriend. She stormed off after he verbally abused her. and he was ashamed of what he had done. He tried to apologize, but it was too late, so he was really depressed, and he went back home to talk to his younger sister, Phoebe, and he tells her his dream is to be a catcher in the rye. Okay, remember that's the song that he heard a young boy singing on his way to his date with Sally Hayes. So he heard that song, and now he has this dream. It's not really something he imagined when he was sleeping. It's just something that we want to do in our lives. I have a dream to travel to Africa or something like that. And so his dream now is to actually be a catcher in the rye, whatever that is. And he thinks it's someone who would stand in a field of rye and stop the children playing there from plunging off a cliff. So he kind of wants to be a father figure here, someone who protects children from hurting themselves.
Yeah, I think at this point he's feeling horrible about life and like no one has protected him. So, of course, he is wanting to change that for other people and to try to protect kids from plunging off a cliff. To plunge means to go from a high level to a lower level very quickly. Maybe you're diving into the ocean from a cliff. You're going to plunge into the water. Or sometimes just putting something into water very deeply, you could say, I'm going to plunge it in. We have plungers when our toilet backs up or our sink gets clogged. That's called a plunger, that we try to get the clog to move along. And so that the water will flow freely. Plunging, though, here just means to go from a high level to a lower level. Cliffs are what we find on mountains. It's the edge of that mountain that you usually can stand on. Don't stand too close because if you go over the cliff, you might die. You have to be very careful around cliffs, especially kids and older people who aren't as steady or stable.
Right, so he's got this plan. Holden tells her his plan to move to Colorado and work on a ranch. And then he makes a quick exit when his parents come home. I guess he's too ashamed to talk to them. He does not quite want to tell them yet that he quit that school.
Yeah.
And so they're probably going to be very angry with him, and they're probably going to call him names and kick him out of the house.
Oh, we don't know.
We don't really know, but they might, But in any case, he wants to move to Colorado. And when most people think of Colorado, they think of mountains. But actually, that's the west part of Colorado. The east part of Colorado is actually quite flat.
It is, isn't it?
For many, many miles. And yes, you could have a ranch there, which is like a big farm where you have animals and stuff like that. So that's what he wants to do. He wants to go work on a ranch. He wants to be in the great outdoors and get out of these big cities on the East Coast and these prep schools and all that stuff.
Yeah. Well, we find out later that the author himself grew up in New York City. And when he lived in New York City, it was very dark, dangerous, just dirty. You didn't want to live in New York City until the 80s, the later part of the 80s, 90s. It was gross and it was very dangerous. So I can see why, he just wanted to go to a remote part of the U.S. that was clean. He could have his dream ranch. If you have a ranch, you also have lots of livestock like cows and steer that they raise for beef. He just wanted to get out of there, and he wanted to be happy. So he does make a quick exit when he hears his parents come home. I guess he's not close enough to them to share how he feels. Now, at this point, we're in the third paragraph. It says exhausted. Again, we use this kind of adjective at the beginning of the sentence to tell you how someone's feeling and how it will impact the rest of the action in the sentence. So he's exhausted, meaning he's so tired. He just doesn't want to do anything. And Holden, at this point, thinks of Allie, his brother, who has passed away, as he walks around New York. So he does live in New York City. And he's just missing somebody he was probably close to, his brother, Allie. He feels like his life is going to end every time he crosses the road. and prays to Allie to keep him safe. Well, I know why he feels like his life is going to end. Because the drivers are crazy in New York. And as you cross the road, there's a good chance a car will hit you. Of course, we have a lot of jaywalkers is the name we give to people who cross the street and they're not supposed to. They're the pedestrians who don't want to wait for the light to change. I'll be honest, I was a jaywalker. Because if there were no cars, I would just cross the street. But it's dangerous. People are very guai here in Taiwan. They tend not to just jaywalk all the time like New Yorkers. If you go to New York and you get a car, you better be careful because people cross the street all the time when they're not supposed to.
Yeah, and at this point, I should say that Holden there is under a lot of pressure because he is 17. And in retrospect, of course, I'm no longer 17, but that does seem to be a very difficult period in people's lives because, hey, you're under pressure to make your big life decision there.
Yeah.
If you don't make the right decision, you're going to screw up your whole life.
You feel that way, right?
You feel that way at the time.
Yeah.
Later on, you realize it just doesn't really matter that much.
Right.
But at the time, it doesn't feel that way. So, yeah, he's under pressure. He feels like his life is going to end at any time. And maybe his brother Allie now is an angel, and he's praying to him to kind of look over him.
Watch out for him, yeah.
Exactly. And he meets Phoebe again, his younger sister.
Yeah.
And he learns that she plans to move to Colorado with him. Hey, big brother, I'm going to come with you to Colorado. And he thinks, well, that's probably not a good idea.
She's too young.
Yeah, she's just a kid,
Yeah.
So he convinces her not to. Don't come with me to Colorado. You're still young. You still need to have your childhood. So if you convince someone of something, you persuade them until they say yes. You use logic and reasoning, and then eventually they accept your idea.
Yeah, so he persuades her. You could also use that verb there. He convinces her. He talks her into... We use that a lot in English too, especially if we're just talking to each other. Oh, he talked me into buying this dress. I didn't need it, but, he convinced me or he persuaded me. Talk someone into doing something. And what he does then as a good older brother is he just takes her to the zoo, where he experiences a moment of pure happiness. I think this is the only time in the book where Holden is truly happy. And you look at why he's happy. He's seen his sister have a wonderful time riding the carousel, which is a kid's ride that you can go on. Usually carousels have horses that go up and down. Have you seen those? And mom and dad will stand next to the fake horse, the plastic horse, and hold their little son or daughter on it. Or if you're bigger, you can hold on yourself. But carousels just symbolize a wonderful part of childhood. And I think he misses being a child. He's now lost his innocence. Remember, he's been drinking. He's been hitting people, verbally abusing people. He had a sex worker approach him. I mean, he's no longer a kid, and I think he misses just being an innocent child.
Yep, there's no greater joy than watching children having a great time there.
Yeah.
So, of course, they're totally innocent and they haven't become bitter and cynical like we adults have. So at this point, Holden stops his narrative. That means he stops telling his story here. Your narrative is your story. And he hopes he'll recover from his bout of depression, and he finds himself missing the people he's spoken about, which would be his brother Allie and maybe some other people there. And he wishes the story could have continued revolving like the carousel. So at this point, I guess he probably entered the mental institution. He was just too depressed to go on. And, of course, there's probably hope he'll eventually probably recover and find something to do with his life. And he does continue the story, or at least he thinks the story should continue like a carousel. A carousel or a merry-go-round, they just go in circles. They revolve.
Yeah, they go round and round. They move in a circle. So, yeah, I think perhaps his parents put him in there just to let him recover for a bit. And then he could move on with life. We hope he recovers. Right now, guys, we're going to listen one more time to our Chinese teacher, and then we'll be back to say goodbye.
课文在第二段告诉我们 ，Holden 偷偷溜回家找自己的妹妹 Phoebe， 跟她说自己的梦想是成为麦田捕手。第二句 He would stand in a field of rye and stop the children playing there from plunging off a cliff. 那他的工作到底是什么？什么叫麦田捕手？就是他会阻挡在那里玩的小孩，怎么样呢？ From plunging off a cliff， 那就是不让他们掉到悬崖下面去。最后一句 Holden tells her his plan to move to Colorado and work on a ranch, and then he makes a quick exit when his parents come home. 最后一句呢，是 Holden 告诉自己的妹妹想要搬到科罗拉多州的计划，他打算在牧场上工作。第3段已经接近故事尾声，这里提到妹妹 Phoebe 居然收拾行李，打算跟 Holden 一起去 Colorado。那 Holden 呢，只好带着妹妹去动物园，看着她骑旋转木马。Exhausted, Holden thinks of Ellie as he walks around New York. 这个句子也一样是分词构句，谁很 exhausted 呢？就是 Holden。Holden 很累，那他想到了 Ellie， 也就是他的弟弟。接下来 he meets Phoebe again and learns that she plans to move to Colorado with him. He convinces her not to and takes her to the zoo, where he experiences a moment of pure happiness watching her ride a carousel. 最后就是小说的结尾咯。Holden 说自己看着妹妹骑旋转木马，近乎落泪，之后就没有再继续交代后续发生什么事了。At this point, Holden stops his narrative. 请同学把 narrative 画起来，就是他的叙述旁白。He hopes he'll recover from his bout of depression. 这里的 bout 指的呢是像疾病发作，那希望呢他的忧郁症不要再发作了。And he finds himself missing the people he's spoken about. 他就发现他之前所提过的这些人，其实他还蛮想念的。He wishes the story could have continued, revolving like the carousel. 请同学把这个 wishes 后面画起来。要注意 wish 后面呢必须要用假设语气。The story could have continued. Could 后面加上 have 再加 PP。他希望这些故事可以继续，但是这些故事其实呢，这个故事其实停止了。那我们用假设语气。好，以上就是我们针对 Unit 11第2天的课程讲解，谢谢。
That is it for today. Thank you for joining us. But please remember to join us again next time when we talk some more about The Catcher in the Rye. We'll talk about the author himself, J.D. Salinger, and we'll talk about some of the themes and ideas in the book and why we think you might want to consider reading it yourself.
Sure.
From all of us here at English Digest, I'm Tom.
I'm Stephanie.
Goodbye.
See ya.